Historians of Reddit, what's your favorite hilarious event from history? Story 1. Eugène François Vidocq, the pioneer French policeman, once tracked down a wanted criminal. The man was attending his pregnant girlfriend who was in labor. Vidocq stayed the night with the couple until the child was born and had a drink with the new father before bringing him in. The grateful criminal then asked Vidocq if he would be godfather of his newborn son, which Vidocq accepted. Story 2. I was reading a textbook today and I came across a siege where King Stephen of England had the son of a baron as a hostage and threatened to kill him if the baron did not surrender. The baron replied that the king could kill his son if new wanted, as the baron still had the hammer and anvil to make better sons. Story 3. Probably North Korea trying to invade South Korea via a tunnel, then claiming it was a coal mine when discovered, and trying to back up their claim by painting a bunch of rocks in it black. Story 4. During World War I, a British spy named Richard Meinerzhagen was in a campaign against the Ottomans in Palestine, if I remember correctly. During the siege he would have care packages dropped behind enemy lines containing cigarettes and propaganda letters. The Ottoman troops would ignore the letters but gleefully smoke the cigarettes, and, over a period of several weeks, became conditioned to receiving them. Until one fateful day when the cigarettes were laced with opium and the British marched into a city too stoned out of its mind to fight back. He went on to become an acclaimed scientist and eventually murdered his wife. Story 5. One of the reasons that Scotland decided to unite with England was because they had lost a huge chunk of their wealth trying to establish a colony in Panama in the 1690s. The scheme was backed by about a quarter of the country's wealth and afterwards left the landowners ruined. The scheme failed because they hired a pirate as an advisor who told them they should bring lots of mirrors to trade with the natives. Story 6. Battle of Stamford Bridge. A single Viking held off the entire Saxon army, killing 30 to 40 before no one would go near him, on a rickety wooden bridge. No one could cross until a Saxon floated under the bridge and stabbed him in the junk, through the wooden slats of the bridge. Cut 2. Saxon army paced the remaining Vikings. Story 7. Native Americans pranking the army during a battle. In November 1864, Kit Carson and army troops attacked a large group of Comanche and Kiowa at adobe walls. They, the soldiers, also heard something very strange, a bugle blaring periodically from the enemy's ranks, blowing the opposite of whatever the army bugler blew. If the federal bugle sounded advance, he would blow retreat. And so on. The Indian bugler was every bit as good as the white buglers, and each time he blew the soldiers would erupt into laughter, in spite of themselves. Story 8. The fall of the Berlin Wall was actually a bit of an accident. Edits impending, need to do some research. As we were taught, a German official was giving a press conference about bringing down the wall and a press corps member asked him when. Supposedly he sort of shrugged and said, "Why not now?" And that is when people took to the streets with sledgehammers. To ease the complications, the Politburo led by Krenz decided on 9th of November to allow refugees to exit directly through crossing points between East Germany and West Germany, including West Berlin. On the same day, the ministerial administration modified the proposal to include private travel. The new regulations were to take effect the next day. Günter Schabowski, the party boss in East Berlin and the spokesman for the said Politburo, had the task of announcing this. However, he had not been involved in the discussions about the new regulations and had not been fully updated. Shortly before a press conference on 9th of November, he was handed a note announcing the changes, but given no further instructions on how to handle the information. These regulations had only been completed a few hours earlier and were to take effect the following day, so as to allow time to inform the border guards. However, nobody had informed Schabowski. He read the note out loud at the end of the conference. One of the reporters, by most accounts, NBC's Tom Brokaw, asked when the regulations would take effect. After a few seconds hesitation, Schabowski assumed it would be the same day based on the wording of the note and replied, "As far as I know, effective immediately, without delay." After further questions from journalists, he confirmed that the regulations included the border crossings towards West Berlin, which he had not mentioned until then. Story 9. Félix Faure, French president, died in office of a heart attack, supposedly mid-slurp, by his mistress Madame Steinheil, who from there on will always be known in Paris as the Kiss of Death. Story 10. Mine comes from the Civil War. The first battle of the Civil War took place at Bull Run on Wilmer McLean's farm. Fed up with the war and for the protection of his family, he moved 120 miles away to Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia. On April 9, 1865, a messenger knocked on his door to ask if they could use his house to negotiate the conditions of the South's surrender. The war started in his backyard, and ended in his parlor. Story 11. Of all the CIA's bat-duck crazy Cold War schemes, Operation Acoustic Kitty was the craziest. In their quest for ever less conspicuous bugs, somebody at the agency thought it might be a good idea to implant a microphone into a cat and use it to eavesdrop on Russian nationals. Somehow there was a terrible mistake, because the CIA thought that this was a brilliant idea. So they took some poor cat and wired it up with a listening device and an antenna in its tail. And then they remembered that cats don't obey orders, so they had to put in a circuit to override its habit of wandering off. The R&D for Operation Acoustic Kitty took 5 years and cost $15 million. After their fun with scalpels and obedience training, the CIA released their one and only working prototype from a van across the road from a Soviet embassy. The instant the cat stepped onto Wisconsin Avenue, it was hit and killed by a taxicab. Whoops. Story 12. Although not hilarious, I guess, it is quite a funny little example of how us Brits actually are. In the 1830s and 40s in the UK, there was a group of people called the Chartists, who pretty much made this thing called the People's Charter, which demanded some parliamentary reform due to the corrupt voting system, poor representation of much of the population. That is, there was a constituency called Dunwich which was literally in the sea, and had 0 constituents, etc. So yeah, it all accumulated in this big presenting of a petition along with the original charter. However, just as this was about to go down, it started to rain. This was not good, and led to the Chartists getting severely downhearted and eventually going home. Keep in mind that the UK government at the time literally got armies back from France in order to defend against a riot which could have toppled the government and constitutional monarchy. And to top it all off, the leader of these riots hopped in a taxi, and went to the pub with the leader of the police against whom he was ready to kill. Story 13. Not necessarily hilarious, but I always found that both primary and secondary source materials relate accounts that ships were so packed together at the Battle of Syracuse that it effectively became a land battle is pretty darn funny. I picture triremes and yakety sax. Story 14. In 1945, near the end of World War II, a common joke among German soldiers was the following. Soldier 1. So, I think I'll take a trip around the borders of the Reich. But because of petrol shortages, I'll have to take my bicycle. Soldier 2. So what will you do that afternoon? And they say Germans are humorless. Story 15. Canadian history is full of hilarious little tidbits. Prime Minister William Lyon Mackenzie King used to hold seances, where he would consult with his dead mother and his several deceased dogs, all named Pat, about matters of government. During the Cold War, a bomb shelter was built to protect Canadian politicians. It was named after Prime Minister Diefenbaker, or Dief the Chief. They called it the Diefen Bunker. Prime Minister John A. Macdonald was an absolute drunk. During a campaign speech, he was unable to hold his liquor, and threw up. His opponent asked if Canada wanted a drunk leading their country, and John A. replied, I get sick sometimes not because of drink or any other cause, except that I am forced to listen to the ranting of my honorable opponent. There are others, but I'll spare you. Story 16. This is one of my all-time favorites. Anna Ivanovna, the Empress of Russia from 1730 to 1740, ordered Prince Mikhail Golitsyn, whom she did not like and had already made a court jester, to marry an ugly servant woman. She then had a 33-foot-high ice palace constructed, complete with an ice fireplace and ice furnishing, to house them on their wedding night. They were then locked in a cage, put atop an elephant and rode to their ice palace where they spent the night in the dead of winter. They miraculously survived. Needless to say, Anna was quite petty. Story 17. Julius Caesar was once captured by pirates on the Aegean Sea. When told that they were asking for 20 talents of silver for his release, he demanded that they increase the ransom to 50 talents. He promised the pirates he would capture them and have them crucified. After the ransom was paid and Caesar was released, he raised a fleet and hunted them down. When he heard that the governor of Asia was going to sell them as slaves, he traveled to Pergamon and had them crucified on his own authority. Story 18. Attila the Hun ravaged Europe, devastating the Roman Empire, and ultimately invaded Italy. Side note, the refugee population from his conquest founded Venice, collecting tribute from the Roman empires. He chocked to death on a nosebleed. Story 19. Herodotus says that Darius II gained the throne of Persia after instigating a murder of the false king, Smerdis, which is a really funny and inaccurate name, by sitting on a horse, along with several other competitors for the throne, sitting on their own horses, of course. Whoever's horse neighed first after sunrise won. Darius cheated by rubbing his hand in the pee of a mare who was in heat. Story 20. While Waterloo was no doubt Napoleon's most crushing defeat, it was not his most embarrassing. In 1807, Napoleon was in high spirits, having signed the Peace of Tilsit, a landmark treaty between France, Russia, and Prussia. To celebrate, he suggested that the imperial court should enjoy an afternoon's rabbit shooting. It was organized by his trusted chief of staff, Alexandre Berthier, who who was so keen to impress Napoleon that he bought thousands of rabbits to ensure that the imperial court had plenty of game to keep them occupied. The party arrived, the shoot commenced, and the gamekeepers released the quarry. But disaster struck. Berthier had bought tame, not wild, rabbits, who mistakenly thought they were about to be fed rather than killed. Rather than fleeing for their life, they spotted a tiny little man in a big hat and mistook him for their keeper bringing them food. The hungry rabbits stormed towards Napoleon at their top speed of 35 miles per hour, 56 kilometers per hour. The shooting party, now in shambolic disarray, could do nothing to stop them. Napoleon was left with no other option but to run, beating the starving animals off with his bare hands. But the rabbits did not relent and drove the emperor back to his carriage while his underlings thrashed vainly at them with horsewhips. Story 21. Backstory: Tsar Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, had several children, but for this story, the only ones that matter are Dimitri and Fyodor. Dimitri was the younger brother of Fyodor. Fyodor, who was intellectually a few sandwiches short of a picnic, would go on to succeed his father as Tsar. Because Fyodor was not exactly suited to being ruler of, well, anything, Fyodor handed off most of the work of governing to a guy named Boris Godunov. Fyodor reigns for roughly 14 years and only manages to father one daughter who died as an infant. The lack of a son meant that upon Fyodor's death, Dimitri would be the next logical heir to the Tsar's throne. Boris, who has decided that he wants to be Tsar, sends the young Dimitri and his mother off to some remote part of the country when Dimitri dies under mysterious circumstances at the age of 8. Fast forward about 10 years. So around the year 1600, this guy calling himself Dimitri, who was most likely just some Polish drifter, shows up in Moscow and makes some vague insinuations to certain people in power that he is the actually Ivan's son Dimitri, the one that died under mysterious circumstances and is therefore the rightful heir to the throne. He claimed that his mother had anticipated an assassination attempt by Boris and had proactively hidden him in a monastery. Boris gets wind of this and promptly has this guy banished to Poland. There, Dimitri managed to win alliances from some Polish noblemen, raised a small army, and promptly invaded Russia. Dimitri and his army actually managed to fight 2 battles on their way to Moscow. However, Dimitri was vastly outnumbered and outgunned. Dimitri surely would have been beaten handily had it not been for the impeccable timing of Boris' death, which allowed Dimitri to march into Moscow unopposed and appoint himself Tsar. Here's where it gets weird. Everyone, who mattered, bought this guy's story. Even his own supposed mother, who was still alive at the time. Dimitri took the throne, had all of Boris' family executed, and proceeded to run Russia for about 9 months until he decided to marry someone of the wrong faith and tried to convert the country to Catholicism. The grand finale: Dimitri, for his religious shenanigans, fell out of favor very fast. In May 1606, people stormed the Kremlin and shot Dimitri to death. His body was drawn and quartered and his remains put on public display until they were ultimately cremated, placed into a cannon, and fired in the direction of Poland. What the Duck postscript: this same story played out 2 more times over the next 6 years with 2 more false Dimitris coming forward. Story 22. If you go to the Place de la Concorde in Paris, you will notice one of the support columns is a bit off, color-wise. When Patton's army was liberating Paris, a tank commander yelled down to his gunner to watch out for the 5th column. Well, he did just that and fired at the column, knocking it down and frightening quite a few Frenchmen. Story 23. I don't know if there's any music literature buffs in here, but I think that the riot after Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring was performed in 1913 for the first time was pretty hilarious. Just imagining a ton of well-dressed people running around, screaming "What did I just listen to?" and throwing trash cans into windows and lighting shit on fire, it just makes me giggle. Story 24. I love the whole Fonthill Abbey farce. Basically, one of the wealthiest young men of 18th century England, William Beckford, commissioned James Wyatt, an architect who once tried to build a house entirely of cast iron, to build a house. Well, a palace, really. 50-foot high ceilings, 30-foot high windows paned with glass, super expensive at the time, and 35-foot high doors, manned by dwarves so they would look even taller. The sad part? William Beckford had been ostracized years earlier for horsewhipping a 16-year-old boy with whom he'd been carrying on an illicit affair. Allegedly because he thought the boy was sneaking around on him with his mistress. Beckford fled to the continent, but returned while the memory was still fresh. Night after night, he sat at his 70-foot-long dinner table alone. The place was never finished, and William Beckford sold it and moved to Bath. Story 25. To get back at Al Capone for killing a friend of his, Eliot Ness decided to humiliate Capone publicly. Ness called him on the phone and told him to look out his window at 11 o'clock one morning. Outside, Ness had organized for all of the trucks confiscated from Capone by the police to be moved from one location to another, going right past Capone on the way. Story 26. In the War of 1812, the British marched to Washington where they were to burn the U.S. Capitol building. British Admiral Cockburn sat in the Speaker of the House chair and said, "Shall this harbor of Yankee democracy be burned?" The British Marines with him yelled aye. Orders were given to torch the building. Story 27. The beginning of the Franco-Prussian War is pretty funny. It was essentially Bismarck trolling the duck out of France because he wanted to go to war. Then he physically tampered with a telegram from the Kaiser in order to go to war with France. Story 28. I like the way my History of Imperial Russia professor described the Russo-Japanese War of 1905. Apparently the Russians thought it would be a great idea to send their fleets all the way around the continent in the opposite direction and surprise the Japanese by showing up unexpectedly from that direction. Plan didn't exactly work, as one Russian ship apparently accidentally fired at an English ship when they were passing by, causing diplomatic issues which delayed them by several months. By the time the Russian fleets actually got to Japan, the Japanese were waiting for them and pretty much owned them. Story 29. I'm not a professional historian, but one of my favorite stories is when the Macedonians, led by King Philip I, were invading Greece during the Third Sacred War, and Philip sent an ambassador to Sparta. This was when Sparta still had a strong military in Greece. After asking the Spartans to surrender, the ambassador read a message from Philip basically saying, "For if my armies are brought to bear upon Sparta, we'll slaughter all your citizens and raze your city to the ground." The Spartan ambassador replied, "If." Both Alexander and Philip both seemed to think invading Sparta would be a bad idea. Story 30. The teddy bear was named after Theodore Roosevelt was out hunting and they wanted it to be a good news story, so they tied up a bear in the woods hoping he would shoot it. He saw it was tied up and let it go. They gave him the nickname Teddy and he completely resented it. Later they named the toy after him. Story 31. The Australian Aborigines used to take down telegraphic lines all the time. Why? Because the insulators made better knives than their flint when broken into pieces. The telegraph companies started to leave crates of insulators at the bottom of the poles. As those were easier to get at, the problem was solved. Also, the workers left stashes of poles and other material in the outback to make repairs etc. easier. During inspection of an existing line, workers noticed a branch which was not documented. They followed it and found it leading into nothing. When asked about it, the local Aborigines told them that they saw the white men do it and thought it was a form of worship for the land, so they built their own until they ran out of material. Story 32. In 1809 there came to Iceland a man named Jørgen Jorgensen on board a soap merchant's vessel. This Jørgen was an adventurous fellow from a Danish middle-class family and had been captured at sea by the English during the Napoleonic Wars, of which Denmark and England were on different sides. He hung around England for some time where he met a soap merchant called Samuel Phelps who hired him to be his interpreter on a trip to Iceland where Phelps planned to buy a lot of tallow for his soap operation. During the height of hostilities between England and Denmark, the English effectively blockaded Copenhagen and prevented any Danish merchants from trading with Icelanders, which left them almost starving. For instance, in 1808 not a single merchant vessel docked at Iceland, so there was a lot of stock available for someone of an entrepreneurial mind. The Danish authorities in Iceland didn't take kindly to English merchants using the war and Icelanders' desperation to their advantage, but being separated from their homeland by an endless stretch of ocean they couldn't really do anything about it. In Iceland there were no military forces, not even a police force. So the authorities huffed and puffed and stalled at every chance they got until the aspiring tallow merchant got fed up and along with his interpreter Jørgen Jorgensen unilaterally declared Iceland to be a free and sovereign nation, of which Jorgensen declared himself protector. So began the Icelandic Revolution, and during almost the entire summer of 1809 Iceland was in effect sovereign and Jorgensen would roam the country, introducing himself as protector and ruler of this desolate island nation, and there was nothing anybody could do about it. The soap merchant's vessel had the only cannons in the entire country. This went on until a British military vessel, on a routine observation mission, stopped by for repair and restocking. When the ship's captain heard of the mess his fellow countrymen had caused, he promptly summoned them to a meeting and told them to cut the nonsense out, brought them back to England where they were charged with number of offences, and the soap merchant lost everything he had. The short-lived emperor of Iceland, Jørgen Jorgensen, spent some time in jail before becoming a minor legend as a sheriff in Australia. Story 33. I'm not a historian, but I do remember reading a funny tidbit about a siege that took place somewhere in the Middle East. I'm not too sure on the details of when and where, so hopefully someone can correct me. But apparently this siege was not going very well, as the walls of the city were nearly impenetrable, and the army besieging the city caught some sort of plague. So, the besieging army began to catapult the sick and dying of their ranks over the city walls. Apparently, the city surrendered shortly afterwards. Story 34. Preston Smith Brooks, August 5, 1819. January 27, 1857, was a Democratic congressman from South Carolina during the period just prior to the U.S. Civil War. Brooks is primarily remembered for severely beating Senator Charles Sumner with a metal-tipped gutta-percha cane on the floor of the United States Senate. Brooks's attack, assisted by fellow Southerner Representative Lawrence Keat, was delivered as revenge, or punishment, in Brooks's words, in response to a virulent abolitionist speech by Sumner in which he mocked Brooks's relative, South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler, and likened Southern slaveholders to pimps. Sumner, who was known for his scathing abolitionist speeches, was severely injured by the attack, suffering head trauma that would cause him chronic pain and symptoms consistent with what would now be called traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder, and spent 3 years convalescing before returning to his Senate seat. Brooks and Keat were not prosecuted or censured for the attack, and both were overwhelmingly re-elected by their South Carolina constituents. Brooks's act and the polarizing national reaction to it are frequently cited as a major factor in the acceleration of tensions leading up to the U.S. Civil War. Story 35. In the days of the Roman Empire, one of the craziest emperors was Caligula, Little Boots in Latin. Caligula was famous for putting a horse in the Senate, but amongst other things, for declaring war against the gods. His train of thought went that any mundane emperor could conquer mortal soil, but only a true god among men could conquer the gods themselves. He lined up every ship in the Roman navy, side to side, and marched a legion to the end of it, equipped with spears. He then declared war on the sea god, Neptune, and the legion hurled their spears into the ocean. The ocean was calm that day, and Caligula declared victory over the sea. Story 36. J. Edgar Hoover wiretapped Martin Luther King's offices, homes, places of interest, etc. Little known fact, kind of funny because nobody ever wants to bring it up, but MLK was a massive poon hound. Because on those tapes was MLK engaging in group shreks, basically an orgy, multi-ethnic apparently. Hoover, being the sick son of a bitch that he was, decided to send the tape to the king's house as a Christmas present along with a note telling King to kill himself or this tape would be released. Problem for Hoover at least was that the Kings got so many presents in the mail it wasn't until several weeks after Christmas that they got around to opening it. Story 37. Sibylla, Queen of Jerusalem, was having some trouble quelling opposition to her coronation as Queen of Jerusalem. Most of the opposition came in the form of disapproval of her current husband, Guy of Lusignan. So she agreed to a divorce on the condition that once she was queen she would be allowed to pick her next husband. After her coronation she promptly remarried Guy of Lusignan, while, I imagine, giving her dumbfounded opponents the middle finger with a smug grin on her face. Story 38. Not a direct history tidbit, but it's still appropriate. In Canadian history Louis Riel, who had this big bitchin' mustache, led a failed rebellion against the newly formed Canadian government that, long story short, resulted in him being hanged and made him a martyr for French Canadians everywhere. A few decades ago they made a TV movie based on his life that portrayed him in this martyr-like fashion, but they took out his manly stash. Clean-faced Louis Riel with no pimp stash, and why? Because only evil characters have giant mounds of manly facial hair, so they made him clean-shaven as a baby's arse. Story 39. Andrew Jackson was a badass. When an assassin tried to shoot him, point blank, the bullet somehow missed him. If you think he's lucky there, just wait. The assassin pulled out his other gun, which he fires at Jackson, which also fails to get near him. Jackson, being the badass that he is, turns around and beats the man to the ground with his cane before the Secret Service can arrest him. Also, the assassin was kinda crazy. My favorite trivia bit about him was that he was convinced Andrew Jackson had killed his dad in 1832, when his dad had died 9 years prior. The more you know. Story 40. Reading these correspondences between an abbot and his ex-student, female. The student was the daughter of a nobleman and paid this abbot to teach her. Long story short, he knocked her up then ran off. The nobleman hired a gang of thugs to track him down, and track him down they did. And they chopped his junk off. So, with that context I'm reading these love letters from this girl to a man who really wants nothing to do with her, or any other girl I suppose. Making this funnier is that they discuss these very complicated theological matters, but the sexual undertone and frustration is right there and, for me at least, is hilarious to read. Story 41. Well, it isn't my favorite moment, but it is pretty fun. During Russian history, there was a time when they were controlled by the Mongolians, known as the Mongol yoke. Anyway, they fought constantly and at one point, there was a battle where a recent rain had separated the two from fighting each other because it had flooded a creek. So what happened was the Russians, quite pleased with themselves, showed and yelled obscenities such as giving them the finger, or the equivalent of, and the Mongolians would reply, so the Russians would reply to that. It went back and forth until eventually the Mongolians left, and so the Russians won the battle. Story 42. King Louis XIII, I think, was around 14 when he got married to the Austrian princess. Story goes, he got married in a ceremonious, monarch-y way, cementing the alliances between Austria and France. They had a great dinner, and Louis XIII went to his chambers, where he was followed by all of the people who worked for him, who basically told him how to consummate the marriage. After he had the talk, the princess entered his chambers. And then his mom, Marie de Medici, entered the chambers. And then his mom watched him have Shreks. A 14-year-old boy's nightmare. Story 43. Woodrow Wilson helped start Vietnam. During the conferences at Versailles, he had lunch at a restaurant in Paris. His waiter, an Asian immigrant, recognized him and tried to chat him up, and Wilson responded with something along the lines of, "I don't talk to little brown people." His waiter was Ho Chi Minh. Story 44. Back in 59 AD, Nero wanted to kill his mother, Agrippina. In her desire to keep power, she began to offer herself to Nero. After hearing the rumors from the common people, Nero figured out that his legions wouldn't follow him because he's an incestuous ruler. After ruling out all the normal possibilities of killing his mother, poison, murder, etc., Nero decides to consult his freedman, who used to be a commander of a fleet in the Bay of Naples. The freedman comes up with a plan to set off Agrippina in a collapsible coat. Nero falls in love with this idea since it is incredibly easy to avoid blame since shipwrecks happen all the time. Nero plays it off when he invites his father to come down to visit him near Naples for some annual feast. Not suspecting a thing, Agrippina gets on the collapsible boat with her retinue and they set sail. After a while, the signal is given and they collapse the boat in the middle of the ocean, the entire crew and all. Those who knew about it didn't get off the boat, and those who didn't struggled to find something to cling to in the chilly bay waters. Agrippina's slave woman calls out to the nearby ships full of soldiers saying that she is Agrippina, and the soldiers beat her down with oars. The real Agrippina has the biggest oh shit moment in history and swims back to shore, where she manages to get back in contact with Nero through some messengers. Nero then has his own biggest oh shit moment in history because his incestuous mother is still alive.